Welcome to the complete history of the Second Age in Middle-earth, a time of great change, power struggles, and the rise of legendary kingdoms. The Second Age spans over 3,000 years, from the end of the First Age and the defeat of Morgoth to the last alliance of elves and men against Sauron. It is a period marked by the forging of the Rings of Power, the rise of Numenor, and the first appearance of Sauron, the Dark Lord who would become the main antagonist of the Third Age. In this video, we'll explore the most significant events, heroes, and villains of the Second Age, bringing to life the epic tales from J.R.R. Tolkien's legendary works. The fall of Morgoth marked the end of the First Age, but the world of Middle-earth was far from peaceful as the Second Age began. After the cataclysmic War of Wrath, Morgoth was cast into the void by the Valar, the godlike beings who shaped the world. His defeat brought an end to the long darkness that had plagued Middle-earth. But the scars of his rule were still fresh, and the aftermath of the war would shape the beginning of the Second Age. The Valar, in their wisdom, decided not to further intervene in the affairs of Middle-earth. They retreated to their land, Aman, across the sea, leaving the free peoples to rebuild and heal the land. Among those left behind were the elves who had fought valiantly in the war against Morgoth. The elves were now free to establish their realms, and many of them chose to remain in Middle-earth, though some took the opportunity to sail to Aman. Those who stayed behind were led by wise and powerful rulers like Gil-galad, the last High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth. His realm was in Lindon, a land that would become a haven for elves in the west. The dwarves too began to rebuild their kingdoms. Their great halls in Khazad-dûm were among the most magnificent constructions of the time. Khazad-dûm, known later as Moria, became a center of dwarven culture and wealth, flourishing through trade and craftsmanship. The dwarves and elves shared a friendship in these early days, especially between the dwarves of Khazad-dûm and the elves of Eregion, a kingdom that would soon play a pivotal role in the events of the age. For men, the Second Age marked a new beginning, especially for those who had fought valiantly against Morgoth in the First Age, the Edain. As a reward for their loyalty and sacrifices, the Valar granted them a special gift, the island of Numenor. This star-shaped land lay in the Great Sea, between Middle-earth and Aman, and it was a place of immense beauty and wonder. The Edain who settled there, known as the Numenorians, became a mighty people. They were gifted with long lives, greater wisdom, and the favor of the Valar. Their first king, Elros, was the brother of Elrond, though unlike Elrond, Elros chose the path of mortality, founding the line of Numenorian kings that would endure for over 3,000 years. While Numenor flourished, Middle-earth remained a wild and untamed land. Many men, those who had not fought against Morgoth, still lived under the shadow of the evils he had unleashed. Tribes of men, some corrupted by Morgoth's influence, roamed the lands, and their cultures were vastly different from the enlightened Numenorians. These lesser men, as the Numenorians would later call them, lived in fear of the unknown dangers lurking in the wilderness, as remnants of Morgoth's servants still roamed freely. But the most significant threat to Middle-earth in the early Second Age lay in the shadows, waiting. Sauron, once the most trusted lieutenant of Morgoth, had managed to escape the destruction of his master. He did not go to Aman to beg for pardon, as some had hoped, but instead remained hidden in Middle-earth, plotting his return to power. Sauron was cunning, and though he had been defeated, he was far from vanquished. He knew that the time was not yet ripe for him to reveal himself. So, for centuries, Sauron bided his time, building his strength and influence in secret, preparing for the moment when he would step back onto the stage as the new Dark Lord. The peace in Middle-earth during the early centuries of the Second Age was deceptive. It was a time of rebuilding and growth, but also a time of unseen threats. The elves, under Gil-galad and others like Galadriel, sought to restore beauty and order to the land, while the dwarves fortified their kingdoms. The Numenorians, too, established their influence in the world, building great ships and exploring the seas, occasionally making contact with the men of Middle-earth. As their power grew, they would come to view themselves as the protectors of lesser men, offering guidance and help to those in need. However, this benevolent attitude would not last forever, as pride and ambition would eventually corrupt even the Numenorians. The Second Age's early centuries laid the groundwork for all the monumental events that would follow. It was a time of great hope, but also the calm before the storm, a storm that would be unleashed by the machinations of Sauron, who even in these early days was already working to corrupt the hearts and minds of the free peoples. The shadows of Morgoth had not yet fully passed from the world, and the seeds of new conflicts were already being sown. While the island of Numenor was rising to greatness across the sea, the men who lived in Middle-earth remained primitive and largely disconnected from the great civilizations of the elves and dwarves. The Numenorians, who were granted long life and immense wisdom, began to explore the coasts of Middle-earth. Their voyages were initially peaceful as they sought to aid the less advanced men they encountered. They shared knowledge and gifts, helping to raise the stature of these peoples, who viewed the Numenorians as almost godlike beings. As the centuries passed, Numenor became the most powerful kingdom in the world. The Numenorians were master shipbuilders and their navy was unmatched. Their capital, Armanelos, was a city of wonder, with towering spires and gleaming buildings. The Numenorian kings, descendants of Elros, ruled wisely at first, and under their leadership, Numenor became a beacon of culture, knowledge, and strength. The elves of Tol Eressëa, who lived in sight of Ammon, would often visit Numenor, bringing with them the beauty and wisdom of the undying lands. However, even as Numenor's power grew, so too did its pride. The Numenorians, once content with the gifts they had been given, began to desire more. Chief among their desires was immortality. Though their lives were long, they were still mortal, and as the centuries passed, the fear of death began to creep into the hearts of the Numenorians. They grew envious of the elves, who lived forever, and they started to question why the Valar had denied them the gift of immortality. The seed of this discontent would eventually grow into a deep resentment that would lead Numenor down a dark and perilous path. As their influence expanded, the Numenorians established settlements and outposts along the coasts of Middle-earth. At first, these settlements were peaceful and beneficial, fostering trade and mutual prosperity. But over time, the Numenorians began to exert their dominance over the lesser men of Middle-earth, who they saw as inferior. They demanded tribute and obedience, and their once noble mission to uplift others gave way to imperialism and greed. Some Numenorian lords, especially those far removed from the more virtuous rule of their kings, began to exploit the lands they settled, amassing wealth and power for themselves. Meanwhile, the elves remained vigilant, sensing the growing threat of Sauron, though they did not yet know the full extent of his plans. Gil-galad, ruling from Lindon, maintained contact with the Numenorians, and they shared a wary alliance. However, the growing pride of Numenor made some elves uneasy. They feared that the Numenorians, in their desire for power and immortality, might become susceptible to darker influences. These early years of the Second Age were marked by great accomplishments, but also by the beginnings of a tragic fall. The Numenorians, once the favored of the Valar, were slowly turning their backs on the wisdom of the West, while Sauron, ever patient, watched and waited, ready to take advantage of the growing arrogance and ambition of men. As the Second Age progressed, these tensions would only increase, setting the stage for the great conflicts and catastrophes to come. As the Second Age progressed, a new power began to take shape in Middle-earth, one that would forever change the course of its history. Sauron, once Morgoth's most loyal servant, had remained hidden in the early centuries of the age, rebuilding his strength and biding his time. Though Morgoth had been banished into the void, Sauron had not been destroyed. He was a Maya, a being of immense power, second only to the Valar themselves. In his heart, Sauron still harbored the ambition to dominate the world, to create order through tyranny, and to rule over all the peoples of Middle-earth. But unlike his master, who had relied on brute force and destruction, Sauron was far more cunning and subtle. He would not attempt to conquer the world through war, at least not at first. Instead, he would try to corrupt it from within. Sauron knew that if he was to bring Middle-earth under his dominion, he would need to win the trust of the most powerful beings in the world, the elves. Though the elves had fought against Morgoth and were wary of dark powers, they were also ambitious and eager to create wonders of their own. They had always been craftsmen and artists, and among them were great smiths whose talents rivaled even those of the dwarves. Sauron saw an opportunity in their desire for knowledge and mastery over the material world. Disguising himself as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, Sauron approached the elves of Eregion, a kingdom located near the Misty Mountains, where the greatest elven smiths resided. Eregion was a flourishing realm, renowned for its craftsmanship, particularly in the creation of beautiful and powerful objects. It was ruled by Celebrimbor, the grandson of Feanor, who had been the greatest smith of the First Age. Like his grandfather, Celebrimbor was driven by a desire to create masterpieces that would endure through the ages. He was particularly close to the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, and the two peoples had established a strong bond through trade and cooperation. Together they created wondrous works of art, tools, and weapons, many of which were unmatched in beauty and strength. When Anatar appeared, he offered the elves of Eregion knowledge beyond anything they had ever known. He spoke of secrets of the earth, of how to harness the hidden powers within materials, and of how to create objects that could wield immense power. Celebrimbor, intrigued by Anatar's teachings, welcomed him into Eregion and eagerly accepted his guidance. Though some elves, particularly Gil-galad and Elrond in Lindon, were suspicious of this stranger and refused to have dealings with him, many in Eregion were enchanted by his knowledge and charm. Under Anatar's guidance, Celebrimbor and the other smiths of Eregion began to forge the Rings of Power. These rings were crafted with the intent of enhancing the abilities of their wearers, giving them greater wisdom, strength, and influence. The elves believed that through these rings they could preserve their realms and achieve a kind of mastery over the natural world, ensuring that their lands would remain untouched by the decay and change that inevitably came with the passage of time. The elven rings in particular were designed to halt the effects of time, allowing their bearers to preserve the beauty and serenity of their realms indefinitely. Unbeknownst to the elves, Sauron's teachings were not as benevolent as they seemed. He had a far darker purpose in mind. While Celebrimbor and his smiths were creating the Rings of Power, Sauron secretly forged a ring of his own, the One Ring. This ring, unlike the others, was imbued with a portion of Sauron's own power, making it the most potent and dangerous of all. Sauron crafted the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom in Mordor, a land he had chosen as his base of operations. Mordor, with its volcanic landscapes and natural fortifications, was an ideal place for Sauron to build his stronghold, and it was here that he would begin to amass his armies. The One Ring was designed to control the other Rings of Power. Sauron's plan was simple. Once the Elves and others had accepted their rings, he would use the One Ring to dominate them, bending their wills to his own. Through this subtle means, Sauron hoped to bring all of Middle-earth under his rule without the need for open warfare. The Rings of Power were not mere trinkets. They were imbued with great magic, capable of enhancing the abilities of those who wore them. Sauron believed that once the One Ring was completed, he would be able to control the minds of the other ring-bearers, and through them, the kingdoms and peoples of Middle-earth. But Sauron's plan was not as flawless as he believed. When he put on the One Ring for the first time, intending to assert his control over the elves, they immediately became aware of his treachery. The elves were far too wise and powerful to be easily manipulated, and they quickly realized that Annatar was none other than Sauron, the servant of Morgoth, in disguise. In a desperate move, Celebrimbor and the other elves of Eregion took off their rings and refused to use them. They hid the 3 elven rings, Vilya, Narya, and Nenya, far from Sauron's reach, placing them in the hands of trusted leaders. Vilya and Narya were entrusted to Gil-galad and Círdan in Lindon, while Nenya was given to Galadriel, who ruled over Lothlorien. Furious that his plan had been thwarted, Sauron launched an all-out assault on Eregion. He led his armies of orcs, trolls, and other dark creatures against the Elven Kingdom, seeking to capture the Rings of Power and enslave the elves by force. The war that followed was devastating. Sauron's forces overwhelmed Eregion, and the kingdom was laid to waste. Celebrimbor himself was captured, tortured, and eventually killed by Sauron, who sought to learn the location of the 3 elven rings. Though Celebrimbor refused to reveal their whereabouts, Sauron did manage to seize many of the other rings of power, those that had been crafted for men and dwarves. With the lesser rings in his possession, Sauron put his next plan into motion. He distributed 9 of the rings to powerful men, kings and warriors who were tempted by the promise of power and immortality. These 9 men, initially great leaders, gradually fell under the sway of Sauron's influence. Over time, the rings corrupted their wearers, extending their lives unnaturally, but also draining them of their humanity. These men became the Nazgul, or Ringwraiths, shadowy servants of Sauron who were bound to the will of the One Ring. The 9 Nazgul would become Sauron's most fearsome and loyal servants, spreading terror and despair across Middle-earth. Sauron also gave 7 rings to the dwarves, hoping to enslave them as well. However, the dwarves proved far more resistant to the rings' corrupting influence. Though the rings of power enhanced their natural greed and desire for wealth, the dwarves did not fall under Sauron's control. Instead, the dwarven rings increased their lust for gold and treasure, leading to the accumulation of vast hoards of wealth, which would later become the source of many conflicts. Some of the dwarven rings were eventually lost, while others were consumed by dragons, the ancient and terrible creatures that coveted the wealth of the dwarven kingdoms. Despite his initial failure with the elves, Sauron's power grew steadily throughout the Second Age. With the One Ring, he was able to dominate the Nazgul, and through them, he spread his influence over many regions of Middle-earth. His armies swelled in number, and his stronghold in Mordor became a place of dread. Sauron's dominion was not yet complete, but his grip on Middle-earth tightened with each passing year. The creation of the Rings of Power and the forging of the One Ring marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Second Age, one in which Sauron's influence would cast a long shadow over the free peoples of the world. The elves, meanwhile, remained ever watchful. Though they had managed to keep the 3 elven rings out of Sauron's grasp, they knew that as long as the One Ring existed, the threat of Sauron's domination would always linger. The 3 elven rings were not tainted by Sauron's influence, as they had been created without his direct involvement, but they were still tied to the fate of the One Ring. If Sauron regained his full strength and recovered the One Ring, even the elves would be powerless to stop him. Thus, the forging of the Rings of Power and the subsequent wars between Sauron and the free peoples of Middle-earth set the stage for the great conflicts of the Second Age. Sauron's ambition to dominate all life through the power of the One Ring would drive the events of the age, culminating in a final and desperate alliance between elves and men to bring an end to his reign. But for now, the Dark Lord's shadow loomed ever larger, and the future of Middle-earth seemed perilously uncertain. As the centuries of the Second Age unfolded, the kingdom of Numenor reached heights of power and glory that had never been seen before among the race of men. Located on the star-shaped island in the Great Sea, Numenor was a paradise, a gift from the Valar to the Edain for their role in the defeat of Morgoth during the First Age. The early kings of Numenor were wise and just, guiding their people with wisdom and virtue. Under their rule, Numenor became a shining beacon of culture, knowledge, and strength. The Numenorians built great cities, their ships sailed to the furthest corners of the world, and their influence spread across the coasts of Middle-earth. Yet, as Numenor's power and wealth grew, so too did its pride. Though the Numenorians were granted long lives, far greater than any other race of men, they remained mortal. The inevitability of death, the one gift they could not escape, began to weigh heavily on the hearts of the Numenorians. Their envy of the elves, who were immortal, grew stronger with each passing generation. Many among them began to resent the ban of the Valar, which forbade them from sailing west to the undying lands. The Valar had established this ban as a safeguard to prevent the Numenorians from seeking immortality in Aman, but the Numenorians saw it as a cruel restriction, one that denied them the ability to live forever. This resentment festered over the centuries, slowly corrupting the hearts of Numenor's rulers. Early kings like Tar-Minastir had maintained close relationships with the elves, sending aid to Gil-galad in the wars against Sauron, and Numenor had long been a friend to the free peoples of Middle-earth. But as the desire for immortality took root, later kings began to distance themselves from the elves and the Valar. They turned their attention away from the west and began to focus on the east, seeking power and dominion over the lands and peoples of Middle-earth. It was during the reign of Tar-Tanamir, one of the later kings, that this growing ambition and arrogance became fully apparent. Tar-Tanamir openly defied the Valar, refusing to relinquish the throne even as he approached the end of his unnaturally long life. He was the first Numenorian king to openly question the ban and to express his bitterness towards the fate of men. His words stirred unrest among his people, many of whom began to speak openly of their desire to conquer death and claim immortality for themselves. The Numenorians' focus shifted from exploration and aid to conquest and domination. In the lands of Middle-earth, their once peaceful settlements became fortified outposts, from which they exerted control over the local populations. The men of Middle-earth, whom the Numenorians had once sought to uplift and protect, were now viewed as lesser beings to be ruled and exploited. Numenorian colonies grew along the coasts of Middle-earth, where they demanded tribute and forced the local peoples into servitude. The Numenorians became feared by the men of Middle-earth, who saw them as invincible lords from across the sea, cruel and distant. This growing arrogance and cruelty did not go unnoticed by the Valar, but they did not intervene. The Valar had long since removed themselves from the direct governance of Middle-earth, leaving its peoples to their own devices. However, they continued to watch Numenor with sadness, knowing that the course its people were taking would lead to their downfall if left unchecked. The faithful, a small faction within Numenor, remained loyal to the Valar and the elves. Led by the lords of the House of Elendel, the faithful opposed the growing corruption of Numenor's rulers, but they were a minority, and their influence waned as the majority of Numenor's people followed the path of ambition and defiance. It was in this climate of arrogance and growing corruption that Sauron, who had been consolidating his power in Middle-earth, saw his opportunity. By this time, Sauron had established himself as the Dark Lord of Mordor, ruling from the fortress of Barad-dûr. He had forged the One Ring and unleashed his armies against the free peoples of Middle-earth. Though he had been temporarily thwarted in his attempt to dominate the elves through the Rings of Power, Sauron's influence was spreading rapidly. Many men of Middle-earth had already fallen under his sway, worshipping him as a god and serving in his armies. But Sauron feared the Numenorians, for their power far exceeded that of any other people in Middle-earth. Though the Numenorians had grown proud and cruel, they still possessed great strength, and their navy was unrivaled. Sauron knew that if the Numenorians chose to oppose him, they could bring an end to his ambitions, and so he devised a plan to bring Numenor itself under his control, not through force, but through manipulation. Ar-Pharazôn, the last and most arrogant king of Numenor, was the one who would bring about the island's downfall. Ar-Pharazôn had seized the throne in a bloody coup, overthrowing his cousin to become the most powerful ruler Numenor had ever known. Under his leadership, Numenor's imperial ambitions reached their peak. Ar-Pharazôn desired nothing less than to be the undisputed master of the world. When word reached Numenor of Sauron's growing power in Middle-earth, Ar-Pharazôn saw this as a challenge to his authority. In his arrogance, he decided that he would confront Sauron directly and force him to submit. In a show of Numenorian might, Ar-Pharazôn gathered a vast army and sailed to Middle-earth. His fleet, the greatest ever assembled by Numenor, landed on the shores of Middle-earth with such force that Sauron's servants fled before them. Sauron, realizing that he could not defeat the Numenorians in open battle, chose a different path. Instead of fighting, he feigned submission. He allowed himself to be taken prisoner by Ar-Pharazôn and brought back to Numenor in chains. But Sauron had no intention of remaining a prisoner. Once in Numenor, he quickly used his powers of persuasion and deceit to worm his way into Ar-Pharazôn's inner circle. Sauron was a master of manipulation, and he played upon the king's deepest fears and desires. He flattered Ar-Pharazôn's pride, feeding his ambition and his lust for immortality. Sauron told the king that the ban of the Valar was a lie, that the Valar were keeping the secret of eternal life from men out of jealousy and fear. He whispered that immortality could be claimed, but only by those who had the strength to seize it. Sauron's words found fertile ground in Ar-Pharazôn's heart, and before long the king had fallen completely under his sway. Sauron was no longer a prisoner. He became Ar-Pharazôn's chief counselor, wielding influence over every aspect of Numenorian society. Under Sauron's guidance, the people of Numenor abandoned their worship of Eru Ilúvatar, the creator of the world, and instead turned to the worship of Morgoth. Temples were built in Morgoth's name, and human sacrifices were made to the Dark Lord, all under Sauron's direction. The faithful, those who still remained loyal to the Valar, were persecuted, their numbers dwindling as Sauron's influence grew ever stronger. But Sauron's ultimate goal was not simply to corrupt Numenor. He sought its complete destruction. He knew that as long as the Numenorians remained, they would pose a threat to his dominion over Middle-earth. To bring about their end, he convinced Ar-Pharazôn that the only way to achieve immortality was to invade the undying lands themselves. He told the king that if he sailed to Aman and claimed the Blessed Realm for himself, he would become immortal and would rule over all the world, even over the Valar. Ar-Pharazôn, blinded by his ambition and pride, took Sauron's counsel to heart. He assembled the greatest armada ever seen, a fleet so vast that it covered the horizon, and he prepared to sail west to challenge the Valar and seize immortality by force. The faithful, led by Elendil and his sons, pleaded with Ar-Pharazôn to abandon this mad quest, but their words fell on deaf ears. Elendil and his followers, realizing that disaster was imminent, prepared to flee Numenor, gathering what ships and provisions they could in secret. When Ar-Pharazôn's fleet finally set sail, the Valar looked upon his defiance with sorrow and dread. They knew that the king's actions would bring about the end of Numenor, but they could not interfere directly. Instead, they called upon Eru Ilúvatar, the One, to intervene. And so, as Ar-Pharazôn's fleet approached the shores of Aman, a great cataclysm was unleashed. The world was forever changed. The seas rose in a great wave, and Numenor was swallowed by the ocean, its once glorious cities and people lost beneath the waves. Ar-Pharazôn and his fleet were utterly destroyed, and the Blessed Realm was removed from the circles of the world, no longer accessible to mortals. Numenor, the greatest kingdom of men, was no more. Only a few ships of the faithful, led by Elendil, escaped the destruction, carried eastward by the grace of the Valar to the shores of Middle-earth. Sauron, too, was caught in the destruction of Numenor. but as a Maya, his spirit endured. Though his physical body was destroyed, he returned to Middle-earth in a new form, more terrible than before. He had lost the ability to assume a fair appearance, but his power was undiminished, and his hatred for the Numenorians and all free peoples of Middle-earth burned hotter than ever. The downfall of Numenor marked the end of the island kingdom, but it was not the end of the Numenorian people. Elendil and his sons, Isildur and Anarion, landed on the shores of Middle-earth and established the realms of Arnor and Gondor, carrying with them the legacy of their fallen homeland. However, Sauron's shadow loomed large over these new kingdoms, and the battle for the future of Middle-earth was far from over. The fall of Numenor marked a turning point in the history of Middle-earth, but the war against Sauron was far from over. With the destruction of the island kingdom, only a small remnant of the Numenorian people survived, those who had remained faithful to the Valar and fled the doomed land before its final destruction. Led by Elendil and his sons, Isildur and Anarion, these survivors arrived on the shores of Middle-earth, where they established the kingdoms of Arnor in the north and Gondor in the south. These new realms of men would become a vital force in the fight against Sauron, but the challenges they faced were immense. Elendil, the High King, established his seat of power in Arnor, while his sons ruled Gondor together, building great cities like Osgiliath, Minas Ithil, later known as Minas Morgul, and Minas Anor, which would later be known as Minas Tirith. Though they were Numenorians, the faithful had been deeply humbled by the destruction of their homeland. They knew that their survival had been by the grace of the Valar, and they sought to uphold the virtues of their forefathers, establishing just and noble kingdoms in the land of Middle-earth. However, Sauron, who had also survived the downfall of Numenor, was not idle. Though his physical form had been destroyed in the cataclysm, his spirit endured. He returned to Middle-earth and, in time, rebuilt his power. No longer able to take on a fair and pleasing form, Sauron became a figure of dark terror, resuming his rule from the fortress of Barad-dûr in Mordor. His lust for power was greater than ever, and his hatred for the survivors of Numenor burned fiercely. Sauron knew that the Numenorians posed the greatest threat to his dominion over Middle-earth, and so he focused his efforts on crushing the newly established realms of Arnor and Gondor. The creation of the One Ring still lay at the center of Sauron's power. With the ring, he could control the minds of his servants, the Nazgûl, who had been enslaved by their own rings of power, and through them he commanded vast armies of orcs, trolls, and other foul creatures. Sauron's influence spread across Middle-earth, and many men, especially those in the east and south, fell under his dominion. These men, known as the Easterlings and the Haradrim, were seduced by Sauron's promises of power and wealth, and they became his allies in the wars to come. The threat of Sauron's growing power did not go unnoticed by the free peoples of Middle-earth. The elves, who had long been wary of Sauron's return, knew that the Dark Lord sought to dominate all life. Gil-galad, the High King of the Elves, had foreseen that the time would come when Sauron would openly declare war upon the free peoples, and he began to prepare for that inevitable conflict. In Lindon, Gil-galad gathered his forces, allying himself with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm and the newly arrived Numenorians. Tensions continued to rise as Sauron consolidated his power, but it was the capture of Minas Ithil that signaled the beginning of open war. Isildur and his brother Anarion had built the fortress of Minas Ithil as a defense against the growing darkness of Mordor, but Sauron's forces overwhelmed the city, driving Isildur from its walls. Sauron claimed the fortress as his own, renaming it Minas Morgul, the Tower of Dark Sorcery, and it became a stronghold for his forces. Isildur fled to his father in Arnor, while Anarion remained in Gondor to defend the capital, Osgiliath, from Sauron's advancing armies. Realizing that Sauron's power was too great for any one kingdom to withstand alone, Gil-galad and Elendil formed a great alliance of elves and men, which would come to be known as the Last Alliance. This coalition of free peoples was one of the greatest alliances ever formed in Middle-earth's history, uniting the elves of Lindon, Lothlorien and Rivendell with the Numenorians of Arnor and Gondor, as well as the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. Together, they marshaled their forces and prepared to march on Sauron's stronghold in Mordor. The last alliance was a desperate gamble, for the combined strength of elves, men and dwarves was still less than the full might of Sauron's armies. Yet they knew that if they did not confront Sauron now, while they still had the strength to resist, all of Middle-earth would fall under his dominion. Elendil and Gil-galad led their armies eastward, crossing the plains of Rhovanion and passing into the land of Mordor itself. The decisive battle of the war took place on the plains of Dagorlad, just outside the Black Gates of Mordor. The Battle of Dagorlad was one of the most terrible battles in the history of Middle-earth. The forces of the last alliance clashed with Sauron's legions of orcs, trolls and Easterlings in a brutal and bloody conflict. Though many lives were lost, the strength and valor of the elves and Numenorians carried the day. Sauron's armies were routed, and the forces of the last alliance pressed onward into Mordor, laying siege to Barad-dûr, Sauron's dark tower. For 7 long years the siege of Barad-dûr continued. The armies of elves and men held their ground against Sauron's relentless attacks, and slowly the defenses of the dark tower began to weaken. Yet, even as the forces of the last alliance pressed their advantage, they knew that the final confrontation with Sauron himself was inevitable. Sauron could not be defeated while the One Ring still existed, and so long as he possessed it, his power would remain undiminished. At last, Sauron himself came forth from Barad-dûr to challenge the leaders of the last alliance. In a great and terrible battle at the foot of Mount Doom, Sauron fought against Gil-galad and Elendil. Both the Elven King and the Numenorian Lord were mighty warriors, and together they confronted Sauron, knowing that this was the final struggle between the Free Peoples and the Dark Lord. The battle was fierce, and though Gil-galad and Elendil fought valiantly, both were slain by Sauron's overwhelming power. But their sacrifice was not in vain. As Elendil fell, his sword, Narsil, was broken beneath him. Yet Isildur, Elendil's son, seized the hilt of the shattered sword and in a final act of courage cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand. With the severing of the ring, Sauron's physical form was destroyed, and his spirit was once again cast into the shadows. The armies of the last alliance stormed Barad-dûr, and the war seemed to be over. The Dark Lord had been defeated, and peace seemed within reach. Yet, even in this moment of triumph, the seeds of future darkness were sown. Isildur, now the High King of Gondor and Arnor, took the One Ring as a prize of war, despite the counsel of Elrond and Círdan, who urged him to destroy it. They knew that as long as the ring existed, Sauron's spirit could never be truly vanquished. The ring was the source of his power, and if it were cast into the fires of Mount Doom, where it had been forged, it would be destroyed forever. But Isildur, tempted by the ring's power, refused to destroy it. He claimed it as his own, calling it the Bane of Sauron, and believing that it was his right to possess it as the heir of Elendil. This decision would have catastrophic consequences. The One Ring, imbued with Sauron's malice and will to dominate, had a corrupting influence on those who possessed it. Though Isildur had won the ring by force of arms, he would not hold it for long. In the months following the war, as Isildur journeyed north to Arnor, he was ambushed by orcs in the Gladden fields. The ring slipped from his finger, betraying him, and he was killed by orc arrows. The One Ring was lost, sinking into the depths of the river Anduin, where it would remain hidden for centuries. With Isildur's death, the One Ring passed out of all knowledge, and Sauron's spirit was left weakened but not destroyed. Though the Dark Lord had been defeated, he had not been vanquished, and the shadow of his power would linger over Middle-earth for ages to come. The great kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor, forged in the fires of war, would face new trials and conflicts in the years that followed. The elves, their strength diminished, began to retreat from Middle-earth, while the dwarves returned to their mountain halls, content to guard their own realms. The victory of the last alliance marked the end of the Second Age, but it was a bittersweet victory. Sauron had been defeated, but the One Ring remained, hidden and waiting for the day when it would be found again. The war had taken a terrible toll on the free peoples of Middle-earth, and though they had survived, the scars of the conflict would be felt for generations to come. The Third Age began in the shadow of this uncertain peace, with the knowledge that the Dark Lord might one day return. Thus, the Second Age came to a close, with the final battle between the last alliance and Sauron serving as both a triumph and a tragedy. It was an age of great kingdoms and terrible wars, of heroes and villains, and of the ever-present struggle between light and darkness. Though the age had ended, the story of Middle-earth was far from over. The One Ring, the key to Sauron's return, was lost but not forgotten, and its discovery would once again plunge the world into chaos, setting the stage for the great events of the Third Age and the War of the Ring.